Good afternoon, everyone, or well, almost afternoon, I guess, for Pacific Coast time. Hi, everyone. My name is Phil. Welcome to this section on managing complex projects with Jira Cloud. We'll be going over hopefully some interesting and useful tidbits on how to manage and hopefully minimize some of the chaos that are associated with complex and growing projects. I'm the head of solutions at ALM Works. We make a product called Structure. And as such, we get to talk to hundreds of customers every year that are doing project and portfolio management. And what I'd like to do today actually is share some of the questions that universally seem everybody wishes they had asked when they started up, and making sure that we're off on the right foot. So what we'll cover today, we're going to start talking about some of the mapping of project data, issue data, field data, when you should do what, kind of best practices set up. The same goes for workflows, linking conventions, and then some of the other stuff within Jira. And then I'll show you a couple examples of how that kind of stuff scales. A lot of this is premised around, the central premise here is we're pretending we're starting a new Jira project, and we know roughly what kind of work we'll be doing, who's going to be doing the work. We know roughly what we need to do to keep things running along. So the story is told kind of as if we have all these decisions to make. But naturally, with any project, but your project in particular, there's a changing nature to this. So these are questions you're going to be asking yourself, not just at the beginning, but at various stages along, when you want to make changes to how many fields you have to your issues, what did the workflow look like. So I'm just kind of assuming we have the ability to make these decisions, and that also that Jira is going to be our single source of truth. That kind of cuts both ways, in the sense that we're talking about Jira as a single source of truth, as opposed to our colleagues not updating their tickets, but also that Jira is not going to be running into syncing issues with other SaaS products in the end. On top of that, what I want to do is I want to mention a couple of limitations, I guess, surrounding just what Jira can do. So Jira is a tool, and I don't mean that in the denigrating sense, but it's a tool in the sense that it fits inside your people, process, and tool kind of paradigm, in the sense that you can use processes to overcome tooling limitations, but you can also use processes to accelerate what you can do with people. And at the same time, tooling can get you further still. However, you can't use a tool to solve a people problem. And tools also are not good at solving process problems. They can highlight them, but what you really want to do is to map all these things correctly, right? You have a culture at work, you have a process that you're using to get stuff done, and then you want Jira to map that and to represent that and reflect it correctly. Now, there are certain things that you can't map to Jira, and that's fine. It's often best not to even try then. But the last thing, don't fight it. What I mean by that is don't fight Jira the tool, right? It's designed to work a certain way, and what you really want to do is to use what it's good at, get the most out of that, and then, where you need to supplement it, whether it's BI tooling or time tracking or visualizing the hierarchy. There is an ecosystem around that, and you have other tools to use for that. However, let's start at the very beginning. Let's talk about project data. What should be its own project? There's a couple different questions that you'll ask at the start here, and this is something that also might change, but usually doesn't. I kind of call it the project versus product dichotomy. Projects generally have to be scoped in time, and that usually means they end at some point, right? You put a bow on it, you hand it to a customer or someone, and then it becomes, something that they will take and run with. Product and product management is kind of this never-ending cycle of work, which isn't meant to sound interminable, but it's definitely kind of like, hey, this is going to keep going. This is a growing backlog of issues. There's a growing amount of issues of work that we're going to be completing and doing. And what that really means is that as the number of issues trends to grow, it's not bounded by anything. And one of the key things that organizations often struggle with, and our organization is no different in a lot of ways, is that it's going to be hard to search for issues. because a lot of times these issues hold decisions within them. We'll get to that in a minute with some of the workflow stuff, but you might have decisions made with feature requests like, hey, we're not going to do this, it's out of scope. Atlassian does this too. They'll tell you what the decisions are based on what your data is telling you. And when someone requests the same thing and they don't have access to your backlog, you don't want to go through the entire thing. You relitigate, like, is this feature something we want to consider? Do we want to do it? All that stuff. You can just look at it in the past, like, hey, we had an interesting one like that before. We decided it was outside of scope. At some point, maybe we'll revisit it, but for now we have a decision. And the same thing kind of goes with generally searching for these things, because when you want to plan things, when you're doing backlog grooming, all that stuff, you have to be able to track information. So a lot of the challenges, like, where are we putting this? What big bucket are the issues going into? And so another big question that you probably already have a decision and about this is the product versus team backlog concept. Sometimes the backlog in the Jira project lines up to the product that you're working on, right? If you have a product called Structure, I don't know where I pulled that name from, you might have a backlog attached to that particular work and that project, right? And so it doesn't matter what the teams are that are doing the work, all of the stuff ends up in this project called Structure. Whereas if you have backlogs attached to teams, which is an option, you will have teams that are working on multiple different things at the same time, and their work falls into their backlog. And this is something that just happens to be the dynamics of the organization. You can do it per team or per project or product. And as long as you don't mix and match things, it's fairly consistent. And this is just about making sure that you can find things in the past, and that a lot of the information that you have implicitly generated through the organization is available by how you organize and architect your Jira schema. The last one I want to talk about here is actually the concept of a shared epic. Generally speaking, if that's a thing, then it should be in a separate project than where the team and the actual product is doing the work. It's mostly a team question. If you can reassign epics of work, they don't necessarily should be they shouldn't be in the team project. They should be elsewhere. If that's not a thing, go ahead and put it in the same project where all the issue work is. And then every level that goes above the epic, whether you call it an initiative, capability, feature, it doesn't really matter. Each one of those should be in its own Jira project. That's really the rule. And all these obviously are just golden guidelines, I guess. They are not hard and fast rules. There will be times to break it, but I'm a big fan of, like, you got to know the rules before you break them, right? You got to know why things are done a certain way before you move along and try and do things differently. Because there's usually a reason why we don't do things, as willy-nilly or haphazardly. The next question is about issue data. We're going to talk about what kind of data do we have, right? Stories, tasks, bugs, spikes, epics, initiatives, objectives, maybe key results. You can have all kinds of different issues. And I'm a big fan of using Einstein's quotation, or abusing it really. Things should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. And really what you want is as few as possible, so long as there is, a clear differentiation between what each one means. If you guys don't do spikes as issue types because you don't want to map them to the sprints, don't have an issue type called that way. Generally speaking, story and task often mean the same thing organizationally. The difference between one goes in a sprint and one doesn't isn't really enough of a reason, I think, to do separately. Bugs are obviously different from feature work, so you want to be able to track these things differently. So basically, when you want to differentiate between these things, have a separate issue type. We'll return to the epic, the shared epics or not, but these things kind of all, you need to decide what the program level of work is and how you want to collect all this and track it. Too many of them, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense. Too few of them, and you'll have people trying to shove, square pegs into round holes. It doesn't work for anyone. As I mentioned, initiatives and above, they exist largely as context for teams generally. So what that means is that they should be linked to the various items below that. So you want to be able to see what the context of the work is. You want to see what you're working towards, not just because it's nice to know what you're doing, but also because that context is often important in the decisions that you make as a team towards design decisions, implementation, trade-offs that you're going to be making. But most of the times, and this also applies to epics really, is that no work intrinsically is done inside those issues. So the work itself is going to be done on that story or bug level, and you're going to roll up things like how much budget's been spent, how much time has been logged, all those things. Subtasks is one of those interesting things. A lot of people don't like them, so they don't use them. Other people really like them and they use them a lot. The guideline here is really just have a rule, have a consistency, and what becomes a subtask and what doesn't. One of the things I actually like to use personally is the fact that epics also have subtasks. So it doesn't have to be epic story subtask in every single way. This is a great way to kind of supercharge Kanban if that's the way you want to use. You can break down epics and then reconstitute them later when it makes sense to put them in different lanes. Anyway, that's kind of the issue data. We're going through a lot of these basics real quick, and hopefully these are questions that you're going to have. They should be relatively easy to answer, but every now and then you're going to come back to it and be like, hey, do we need another issue type? Do we need something else? Well, the same considerations still apply whether the project is currently in flight or at the start or near the end. The last thing when it comes to the issues, I want to talk about field data, basically what becomes a field. There's an important distinction here with data and information that I want to discuss because I think it's important. Things like WSGIF or any other calculation that you could be performing to make decisions that are based on other fields is information. You have data points, and when you put them together and do something, whether it's adding, multiplying, dividing, doesn't really matter, you're turning that into information, but effectively it's a duplication of information you already have. So adding a field to your Jira ticket's easy, and it's a lot trickier to remove one, obviously, but every time you add a new one, you have, especially if it's related to previous ones, the potential for duplication and for inconsistencies that arise. And what you really want to do is not have any situations where ambiguity, inconsistency, one field got updated, but the other one didn't. So things like that are really important to look out for. And you can get the information like the weighted shortest job first that I mentioned in different ways. So as long as the information is present in the field, you can perform calculations in a number of different ways that give you that information that you need without that risk of duplication or potentially running out of sync with different fields. It's generally a good idea to use templates for your teams. It's really important when you scale out Jira usage, like you'll start with, say, software teams, and then you might move on to something along the lines of, hey, we're going to pull marketing in there. We'll have design in here. We'll have graphics, all that stuff. So you'll want to have some guidelines in terms of how your teams are handled. You also don't want to be too rigid and too flexible, because too flexible means just you can't compare and contrast anymore. But too rigid also means that things get placed in the wrong kind of cubby. So one of the rules of thumbs that I always thought was good for this is that teams should be the ones to agree on these things. So if you have a template and you have 3 teams that are using it because you have 3 software teams, have them agree when a field needs to be added. If all 3 of them agree, add the field, because you're not going to win that debate anyway. They outnumber you, but also they have a consistent reason. And generally speaking, the more people are comfortable with Jira, they will also be hesitant to keep adding new fields. They know what this kind of dilution, but also pollution of the data will mean. And again, enforce consistency wherever possible. It's hard to compare already story points to estimates. That's something that everybody already runs into. But if you have to compare sizes like t-shirt sizes to story points, it becomes really kind of hard. So if you want to have regular comparisons, especially between teams that are doing work together, it's a good idea to have comparisons be done like to like, right? So we're going to compare a number to a number. We're going to do categorical data to categorical data. As long as we're consistent, good. And there is this first choose wisely moment where the field data can be made mandatory. If it isn't, it's going to be empty a lot. The developers usually take the path of least resistance. So as long as there's no error when they fill in a form, they'll happily leave it blank. The flip side of that is that if it is mandatory, and that means they have to fill it in. And if they don't have information to fill in yet, you're going to get a lot of ASDF keyboard matching information there. So be prepared to handle either empty data or garbage data. And there is some nuance to this exactly, in the sense that fields may not be mandatory at creation. They can be made mandatory later in their workflow state. we'll dive into that a little bit more, but that's definitely kind of a level of nuance you have. And then finally, anyone who owns the backlog, and I'm a big proponent of that being one person, should have several dimensions to search for issues. And this is where fields come in. Generally speaking, there'll be either they need to approve an issue or they need to be the ones that even create it, maybe a little too strict for most organizations. But generally speaking, this is not just about, we fill in something, we throw it over the fence, and we never look at it again. This is where information is stored that we need to reference later, and we might be doing the work here, and we need to be able to ask follow-up questions. So the person who is constantly referring and grooming, tracking in and out of this particular backlog should be able to find these things. And so it's important that this person also understand the dynamics of Jira, the dynamics of the work coming in, how it's coming in. And like there needs to be consistency, because Jira search is, well, JQL is great, but searching by text is kind of tricky. And so that already means with like, hey, there should be a rule in how we write the summaries, should be a rule for how we fill in all these different things so that I can look along multiple dimensions to find this information. Next up is the workflow. So we've got workflows in the sense of statuses, and then the transitions between each ones. I'll have a separate one where we focus kind of on WIP, the concept of work in progress. But for now, one of the elements is it's handoffs. What we see a lot, at least internally for us, but also with a lot of our customers, is that developers do work and then they give it to QA. Whoever's testing it, you can call it the testers, it could be product testing as well. If that information kind of ping pongs back and forth, like at some point if QA rejects something or requires a fix and it goes back to the devs, you're going to have this kind of back and forth effect. There's a big deal whether you want this to be a workflow transition, so you want to track this, or do you just say, hey, the dev is done with the work, this thing is closed, we're going to create a new issue attached to that automatically, and then the QA is going to run with it. And then anything that's wrong becomes a bug. These are decisions that you need to make based on what you want to track, what you think is important, whether you want to use the automation to auto create new tickets each time, or if you just want to put everything in a single ticket. A lot of it will depend on how you are going to be searching for this, what kind of reporting you're going to be running on that. So information, it matters where you put it, and there are definitely some trade-offs associated with it. I mentioned earlier we want to map our process to Jira. So status is one of those things that you're going to be using because it signals a lot of information. And you can be as simple as you want, like Jira out of the box comes with to do, in progress, and done. And a lot of times you need a little bit more nuance in all three categories, really. So what's really important is that we know what each thing means, right? So we've got status categories that are the same as the ones I mentioned before, and we've got individual statuses. We want to have some where we can put things so that people that reference this, that are watching these tickets, can see automatically, go, oh, hey, this is what's going on. So this is what my expectations are. It's in testing. Well, that means I'll wait for the testers to pick it up. It doesn't make sense to bother the dev. If something is waiting for approval, you can put that either in the status, or you can create a new ticket that becomes the backlog for the approver. Whoever you want to put the onus on making sure this work doesn't stick in work in progress, that's kind of what you're going to have to architect into this project. And then there is a whole host of potential hooks and operations that you can tie into both statuses and these transitions. The list is really, really long. You can tie into multiple things. You can do reporting. And it's really important to have a consistent process that you can use, because oftentimes transitions are really great places to say, hey, something's happening here, something else should happen. Let's make sure that's an automatic thing. So try and remove human error. People are liable to forget things, so remove that from the equation. We'll talk about it later, but automation is an awesome kind of way to do that. The other aspect of workflows, I think, is WIP, work in progress. The only real thing I want to focus on here is the fact that there's this status. We all have it in our workflows where work kind of goes to die. It can be waiting for solution. It can be kind of waiting for comments. There's a lot of like different statuses where it's kind of punted to someone else because we're waiting on a decision, someone else to make the decision or force it. We can't do anything anymore. Things like that. Do not get rid of that status. It's actually quite important that you have one of those, ideally only one, but it's important to have that because that's somewhere you want to track. If you are in charge of the process, this is a place where you go and be like, oh, hey, there's like a whole bunch of tickets here in this status. How did they get here? Well, it could highlight a missing part in your process. It could highlight a workflow improvement that you could easily add to it. It could just, highlight something like, hey, we're working with customers and none of them are getting back to us. Well, maybe we should set something like a time limit to say, hey, if this is taking 2 weeks, no one gets back to us, it's clearly not that important. It will go somewhere else. So there's a lot of information actually when it goes to these kind of terminal statuses that you can use to improve kind of your internal processes. The other one is kind of that great, adding more status is a great way to limit WIP, but also to not limit WIP. I like to say it kind of speaks for itself, but basically adding more doesn't mean you will have less work in progress, right? It's just more places to put it. At the same time, sometimes you are waiting indeed on customers, and then it doesn't really fall into the work in progress category in the same way that you can do 3 things at the same time. So making sure that this really lines up with core values that you have is important. What you'll see, especially with multiple, if you have too many statuses, is that the status changes don't mean anything. That's also another key where process improvements, they're there. And the other thing, this is one of the things I like about the Kanban boards, is that you can filter by assignee and then the board looks drastically different. So what looks like a lot of work in progress could potentially just be everybody's got one thing they're doing. You just have a lot of people on this team. But vice versa, setting that filter up by different assignee will allow you to see, hey, Mike has 5 different items in that status. Maybe we should talk to Mike. He can tell us a little bit what's going wrong, suggestions on how to improve this. Linking conventions. So let's talk a little bit about that. There's really we see this a lot as work breakdown structure and a hierarchical tool. A lot of challenges around linking conventions. I worked with a PM group once that had 53 different types of links inside their Jira instance. We can safely say that is a few too many. So I generally follow 2 rules, and this kind of really covers most people's needs. For anything that's a non-hierarchical link, so think of blocks as an example, these should be between like items, right? Stories block stories. Stories don't block epics. It's kind of an area where you're going to run into a lot of confusion. Bugs can block tasks because they're kind of at the same level, right? They're program level items. So there are elements in those categories. The same goes for things like relates and duplications. They kind of live in the same level. The other one is that there is a single link type usually given for breaking things down into hierarchical things, but also for everything else. There should be one link type for a given meaning, right? And this meaning is on all dimensions. Blocks is something, this item cannot start until this item is completed. Great, that's a blocking relationship that is consistent across everything. If you have hierarchical links, implements is a really popular one, right? You have initiatives above your epics, great. An initiative is implemented by the epic. We document this, we agree upon this, we'll have automation rules in place so that we can't mess this up. And anytime we add new issues, we need to bring them into this work breakdown structure, and we need to be unambiguous of what this means because we can't find them otherwise. And so one meaning should have one link type, and that should be it. And that alone usually means there really only is a need for a couple link types. You really don't need more than that. There might be some exceptions that prove the rule, but generally speaking, that's kind of all you really need. The last thing before I kind of walk over how a lot of this will manifest, especially the dysfunction attached to all these issues, is some of the other things that come with Jira, because that's what we've talked about so far. Automation for Jira, Atlassian bought this, I think, about a year and a half ago. This is amazing. Like, no one uses this enough in my experience. And like I said, I talked about 100 people or 100 customers a year. This is your superpower. You can basically codify what your processes are. You can sidestep any kind of human error. If someone needs to fill something in, great. We got to make this mandatory. If this status transition means an email needs to be sent to someone so that they can look at it, great, put that in there. And it's a great way to perform timed operations. Remember that black hole status? Cool. We have one internally, for example, the status is literally called limbo. And any ticket that hasn't been updated in 2 weeks automatically gets transitioned to limbo. And so I can look at the limbo category a couple times a week and see if anything just isn't moving along. And I can ask people. And usually what this means is they haven't looked at it in 2 weeks, right? Because if you add a comment, the timer restarts. So this is a great way to kind of add regular audits, make sure information is being there. You can track by so many different kind of criteria. It's really kind of, no one's using it enough. Like I said, there are some things that you want to obviously not do too much of from a performance perspective, but generally speaking, there's a lot of ways to make your life easier if you use that more. The other thing that I would recommend, and this is just kind of an evolution of how things are going, is the double-edged sword of the software as a service everywhere. Now, I think in general, this is a great, a great evolution in the marketplace that we can actually add more things easily. We can bolt things on. The problem is that as organizations grow, there are a lot of different people that want this, they want that, they want that. And when it's easy to add these systems, it's also easy to lose information in a lot of these places, right? They become the dark corners where, oh yeah, right, we're going to look for that. That information's in Salesforce, and this information's in Jira, and this information's in Slack, and this in Confluence. And so you're going to lose stuff because you're going to be looking for it in one place and it's going to live somewhere else. And the challenge here is we're not going to add any issues or not add any SaaS products to this. It's just making sure that you are clear where the single source of truth is for all these things. It can be Jira. It doesn't have to be Jira for everything. CRMs are there for a reason. But just make sure the organization knows where to put information, where to find information, where to look things up, because you are evolving, you're managing complexity, and in so doing, you want to make sure that you can find the information that exists, because nothing is worse than, remembering, oh, yeah, right, there's a Confluence page for that, and I cannot find it, right? Well, imagine that times, I don't even know what app to look in. You're going to spend a lot of time looking for information. That time is obviously better spent doing the actual work that you want to do. So a lot of the goals here is to spend less time in the tools and more time doing the actual work. They need to be tools to facilitate your life, not something that you're going to spend most of your time in. And finally, with all the tools that we talked about, people are still going to be your best friends. And I talk about that in the sense of vendors, so software vendors, the partners in the Jira ecosystem, colleagues, people you meet at the ACEs, at Summit. Hopefully we can meet each other in real life. A lot of these people have run into these problems before, and they can probably help you, miss a couple of these potential traps. And they can tell you, well, we did this and it didn't work because of this, this, and this. Or you can just use them as a sounding board to pitch ideas on. And so it's a great way to kind of get information without having to do a lot of this stuff in Jira and trial and error it. A lot of people have done both the trial and the error part. So make use of that. And the same goes with like questions if you have like, hey, I want to use this integration to solve this particular problem. Well, ask the vendor. They probably have heard this question before, I can tell you that. If you're working with a partner, ask the partner. They can do the same thing for you. Like, oh yeah, we've done this for a couple of other customers. We're happy to kind of do this for you. We've got all this knowledge, whether it's a migration, something along the lines of a custom implementation, maybe they get to code something up for you. Most people are happy to point you in the right direction. So even if you aren't able to use the solution, you know what it looks like, and you can make the correct cost benefit analysis towards like, is this worth doing or not, and save time doing that. So all that, I spent about 30 minutes now, almost on the dot, telling you about how to set up your Jira. And the reason we did that is because as usage grows, so as the amount of users grows, the amount of tickets grows, the amount of different complexity and types of projects that you're running grows, you are going to either have a well-structured data set to work with, in which case your life gets very, very easy, or you're going to have a bunch of dysfunction that you need to fix. And well, odds are you're somewhere in the middle, to be honest with you. But I want to show you a couple things that we can do that we've seen as vendors of structure that highlight when this information is useful, what you can do with it, some of the add-ons ones that can make your life simpler. And then hopefully we can use this to kind of move on, because we have a question and answer session in about 30 minutes. So I'd love to hear questions you might have. By all means, you can type them in now as well. I'll try and get to them after this. Tell me all the reasons I'm wrong in all the slides I mentioned before, why you do something or why you do something else. But I do want to walk through a couple of use cases where if you do it wrong, this is why it's not a good idea to do it that way. And this is why we recommend doing it this way. And then why we can kind of build on this incrementally. So without too much further ado, I'm going to walk over to my demo for Structure. So Structure is a PPM tool that has now seemingly disappeared on me. Oh, hey, my screen share has disappeared. Delightful technical challenges. All right, I will fix this for you, I promise. We're still alive, we're still alive. So I'm going to share my screen again. There we go. All right, so hopefully you guys can still see my screen. As the curse of the demo will have it, my stand literally decided today was the day to give up, and it collapsed. So we're going to do this on the fly. As I mentioned, we make Structure, which is a visualization tool mainly built on the hierarchies that you have inside your Jira instance. One of the biggest things that we'll note is that when we start a project, when we're looking at issue data, we have mostly flat lists when we work on it, right? If we build a filter, we can have a bunch of different filters attached to it. And JQL is really good for getting this information, and we can see a lot of the details here. But as information grows and as the number of issues we want to manipulate with, one of the things we're going to be missing here is we don't really want a flat list. What we really want is context around this information, how we can use it. Because while it's great to be able to look at it here and I can pull up all the other epics and the stories attached to it, I want to look at this information slightly differently. So the next obvious step is we can look at it from, say, the sprint perspective. So doing that gives me active sprints, also the backlogs, and I can look, actually the backlog is where I spent a little more time than the sprint view. I can see it by epic, I can see it by versions, right? If we're using a fixed version to track this information, all of it goes here. I can track it by time. We're clearly a little late for the MVP here. And this information is fine, but again, it doesn't quite give me that nuance that I want. And the reason being is I still cannot see if these two things are done and how that impacts the epics. Now I can open this up and I can see the progress bar. Roadmaps is the next obvious look at it. Roadmaps, however, is contained to a particular project. And that's a limitation that is fine until we get to larger works, right? And one of the challenges with managing complexity is that a lot of this information is going to be living in different projects, Jira projects. And so what we need is some way to track across that. So we've devised a solution for that called Structure. What it does is it allows you to work across projects in a way that you are interested in. And so there's a couple different elements that I want to focus on that hopefully give you a taste of what we can do. So the first one is what we call automation. So these are the rules, kind of like the filters that build up the boards. This is how we can decide what the scope of work is that we want to look at. So I've recreated the board here. I've got the epics of a specific type. If I don't want to be limited by the particular project, I can see cross-project this information will update on the fly, which is cool. Like you can see how a lot of this information works together. We also have linkages. So with the rules for extending, we can track issues across those linkages. And the reason I say this is this is the more powerful when you have best practice involved. It's a great way to kind of move things around and realize like, hey, this data needs to look a certain way. And if it's not here, we need to move things, we need to clean up the data, but at the same time, at a glance, we can see things like progress. We can see things like, let's add story points. And we can add the summation of the various story points in one place and then use that to basically kind of map it and see what the roll-up is, because the epics doesn't have story points attached to it. So this allows you to also get information based on the relationships as opposed to directly just the issue details attached to the work we're looking at. The other thing that I think is helpful here is the ability to add a little bit more nuance. So one of the other things that I have a lot of conversations around is the fact that we estimate in a lot of different ways. And as long as we're consistent, we can get consistent data. We have story points, we have original estimates, we have t-shirt sizing. I know someone who worked with the metaphor on IKEA furniture and different types of construction projects. But effectively, you have different dimensions of data that you want to put together. And so this information needs to become visible and accessible, because for teams in particular, information access and information transparency is what empowers them to make the right decisions. And so the first thing they need for that is the information to be accessible and to be visible in different ways. So especially around portfolios of work, the more you have, the easier it is to put them together. And as long as you can put them in some kind of hierarchical data, so you can see how things relate to one another, you've got a lot already working for you. The other thing I want to mention before I hop onto any Q&A is the ability to basically extend this to a timeline, right? We want to roadmap some of this. The way we've done that is we added a Gantt chart to our structures. So interesting. Ooh. I am on fire today. There we go. Maximize. Give me Gantt. Interesting. It does not want to give me my Gantt chart. Cool. All right, well, we're gonna have to pretend that didn't happen. I try and reload this, but my karma has clearly run out today. Both my laptop stand and now my app has completely died on me. Good thing I know who's responsible for this. I'm gonna go yell at some more developers in a minute. Well, with that being said, let me open the floor to questions. I saw we had one. Do we have the capability to scan our code in automation for Jira that would provide a deprecated code? Well, it could be dark process that would be beneficial in the complex to complex that you can let us know to help ourselves in those lava cases. Interesting. Yes and no. So I'm going to try and answer this to the best of my understanding, but if I'm interpreting this incorrectly, please clarify and ask another question. But deprecated code in and of itself kind of doesn't fall under Jira. It kind of deployment, you'll have Bitbucket hooks. So automation does connect to Bitbucket. And so you can actually get certain things like tags and other things available. I know that there is also an extension and there's a lot of operations you can do on the Bitbucket side of things, but it's a little bit outside of my area of expertise. So I wouldn't want to comment too much and say with certainty that yes, you can do this and no, you can't. A lot of it will depend also on how you define deprecated. It could be by branch, it can be whether it's kind of still being used or not. Deprecated code can also be third-party modules. There's a lot of stuff in here, but generally speaking, I would stick to keeping automation for Jira focused on your Jira tasks. So what that really means is that you're going to want to focus on the project management, the product management side of things. So making sure that work that is in progress or attributes of each issue are correct, are consistent, are up to date, because those are kind of the areas that you really want to focus on, right? Is the information correct? Is the information correct right now? And is the information complete? Because that's the other thing that you'll have as a responsibility for you. To make the right decisions, those are the three dimensions really that you need to focus on. And if you're missing on one of them, then you are potentially making the wrong decision because you have outdated data to base that particular decision on. Let's see. If anyone has any other questions, obviously, please let me know. I will try and track them through the chat. If not, you can obviously find me at the breakout session in 20 minutes. I encourage you to come there and take your best shot. Tell me where you disagree with all these things. one of the things that I think is most interesting is where structure kind of fits into this particular realm. Hopefully by then we'll get the Gantt extension up and running, but there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of functionality that I think is very helpful. And ironically, one of our goals is to make you spend as little time in Jira as possible so you can figure out what's going on, what do we want to do, where do we need to focus our attention on today, and then kind of gut and focus your attention there. All right, so far no other questions. I'm hoping that means everything was clear. If not, I will flip right over to the next slides so you can see what's coming next. That would be right here. Share that for you. So apparently, guys, break time coming next. Like I mentioned, if you have any follow-up questions that you want to just set up one-on-one, please use that opportunity either here at the event, or you can just send us an email at solutions@almworks.com. We got the breakout session at 12. I believe that's Pacific time. And otherwise, obviously, pick one of the other ones. I know Phil Fox, for example, from Adaptivist. That'll be interesting. I might watch that later. So thank you guys very much for watching. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to fire them my way. And otherwise, hopefully speak to you soon.